Our next movement is realism, which basically adheres to the tenets that it professes, right? It's going to be about the real. So if you think about romanticism, right, that we just covered, romanticism was often about a fantasy. It was about emotion. It was about the unreality of things. It truly was what art really professes to be a lot of the time, which is again about creating a fantastical world, right? Something that's not real. So realists were going to shift in the opposite direction again. And you have this quote from Courbet: "Show me an angel, and I'll paint you one." So realists believe very strongly that you can only represent in art what you could actually see, what you could actually experience, and anything else was disingenuous. It wasn't real, it wasn't true. And so they wanted to show you the reality of life around them. To understand the time period, it's really important to think about these concepts and these ideas. What really informs what I call the time of modernity and revolution. First off, we have to talk about the term modernism in general. So, modernism really refers to art and culture that take place between like 1850 and 1950, 1960, somewhere in that range. Um, if you really called an artist today modern, who was working today modern, that really would not be what an art historian would say. We would say they're a contemporary artist. For instance, my background, my specialty is contemporary art. I work on artists who work now, who are alive now and making art right now. Modernism, again, in an art historical sense, really applies to the time of 1850 to about 1950. And this is the time when the Industrial Revolution has just happened, has just started, and you start to see the idea of modernity kind of creeping into everything, right? Everything is being updated. It's being, it's a time of invention. It's a time of possibility. And that spirit of modernism infects art as well, right? It makes artists think, they don't have to do the old subjects. They don't have to do the old techniques, right? They can do something new. And so modernism, just as an idea, I think is really important to consider, and how it really begins in the middle of the 1800s, again, and goes really to the middle of the 20th century, and is informed by all these new inventions kind of popping up around, right? Electricity, the steam engine, right? All of these things are making people look at their lives differently. You also can look at the art terms of avant-garde and art for art's sake and consider what they mean for us as well as art historians. When something's avant-garde, right, it's a French term. Avant is before, garde is guard. When something's avant-garde, right, it's on the cutting edge, right? It comes before, it's new. Avant-garde was actually a military term that referred to the first group of soldiers who would go out into a battle. They were usually considered fairly skilled, and again, we're the cutting edge of fighting, let's say. So, in the term of art, right, avant-garde artists are thought to be cutting edge, leading, right, the call to something new and something different, right, to something modern, right, modernity. So these artists who are going to be looking at really moving forward are going to be known for having an avant-garde spirit. They're going to be rule breakers. They're going to defy the norms. Now, think about the fact that a lot of the artists we've studied previously were popular because they knew how to work with the right patrons and they knew how to get the right commissions. Someone like David, for instance, who really knew how to work the system, or even Michelangelo, he knew still where to go where he wanted money, right? He wanted work. Artists used to have a much greater interest, right, in doing what was going to sell, might we say, or they knew that they needed patronage. The idea of avant-garde changes that, right? It really allows for artists to strike out on their own and try to make their own way in a sense. And that feeds into the idea of art for art's sake. Art usually has some type of purpose when you think of art history. Even in this class, we've talked a lot about, art made for religious purposes. We've talked a lot about art made for like kings and rulers, portraits, those kind of things, genre art. There's usually some kind of purpose, right, that is within the art, let's say. And when you get to modernism, they start to create art that they call is art for art's sake. It's art for its own reasons and its own purpose. It doesn't have to satisfy a patron. It doesn't have to have a reason for existing. This is when the rules start to be broken very, very firmly. And this is when I personally think it gets really interesting in art history. Because you're not just looking at the same old subjects anymore. You're looking at things that are new and fresh. You're looking at artists who are saying, that's never been done, let me try it. And so I'm always getting really excited around this time of the class because this is the art I love. This is the art that I really enjoy, is art that exists for its own reasons, that's truly avant-garde and truly cutting edge. The realists are the first movement to really embrace all of these ideas and carry them forward as artists. The first artist we'll look at when looking at realism is Gustave Courbet. And this is his work, The Stonebreakers. Now, Courbet, of course, said, show me an angel and I'll paint you one. So I'm sure you can figure out how Courbet felt about religious subjects. He didn't do them because, again, to him, religion is something unprovable. That's not something a realist would be interested in. So what does he turn to as a subject? He turns to everyday people. Now, you might look at this painting and say, what's so shocking here? But if you know the time period, you would know it was indeed shocking because what the subject matter is everyday people. It's everyday workers. And this wasn't usually something that was celebrated. You see a couple genre works, when you look at the Dutch and things like that. But to really, really, truly to show people doing back-breaking, hard labor, like stone breaking, which is what these gentlemen are doing, that wasn't usually considered very art worthy, may we say, right? That's not something that you would say is a worthy subject. So we may not look at this painting immediately and think of it as shocking, but when Courbet showed this work, people were like, what the heck, Why am I being shown these dirty workers on the side of the road? Art's supposed to elevate, art's supposed to be aesthetic, art's supposed to be a feast for the eyes, right? Remember Delacroix. And they would say that Courbet wasn't doing those things. So again, this was a highly, highly controversial work, showing real people at their real business, showing them as they really live their lives. And I think the work is really brilliant because the sort of composition puts us down on the level of the worker. So in a sense, we almost are there working with them. We're not above them or looking down on them. We're sort of right there, right? And their backs are to us. We're just like with the soldiers in Goya's 3rd of May, in a sense, you can almost put yourself into the person's shoes, right? There's a sense that you can kind of extend yourself into their shoes. And one is young and one is old. So I always feel like you can think about this as a timeline, that you could start doing this work very young and do it to your old. The idea of the reality of work for people. And, let's face it, work sometimes isn't fun. I mean, I love art history, but I'm not going to lie. Sometimes my job has its bumps and bruises and bureaucracy, right? So work is work. It can be hard. It can be exhausting, right? It can be frustrating. But the idea of you could be trapped in this job that's just day in and day out, Courbet's really trying to pull at that and make you think about that, the reality of what if you started out as a young man doing this and ended up an old man doing it, and there was never a reprieve, there was never an escape. That's what it is, right? He's giving you that really truthful feeling, right, of being with these workers. And so this really revolutionized painting in France and in Europe in general, where people had never seen anything like this. And they just were like, they couldn't believe it. They couldn't understand what Courbet was trying to get to. But again, he begins a movement through works like this, where they really start to say, what is the reality of people's lives? The people are drab, they're dirty, right? They really are just as they are. Unfortunately, this painting was actually destroyed in the bombing of World War I, right? So during the World War II. So during the bombing, right, the painting was destroyed, right? It was actually in the fire, and we no longer have it. So that's a side note about this painting that's rather sad to consider. Another famous Courbet that I always love to show you is his famous burial at Ornans. And Ornans was the town that he was from. So he was painting real people that he knew. This was also something that was really strange to critics at the time. You usually use models or use people that, you didn't have a relationship with. And even if you use models, you usually kind of changed up their features or something. But he literally was painting the people of the town that he came from. And he was doing so very realistically. So that was the first thing that people were really like, what is this? What is this painting? The second thing is that he did it on a monumental scale. It's obviously hard to tell on a slide like this, but it's a very large, giant painting, almost on the same scale as, like, David's Oath of the Horatii, which is a very, very large painting, or Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People, which is another huge, huge painting. So a lot of the critics talked about how he was monumentalizing the everyday, and they meant that in a bad way. That he was monumentalizing normal people doing normal things. Oh, the horror, right? But that was the attitude, right, of critics, is that this was unacceptable. So people were very shocked. The other thing that was shocking about it is the subject matter. That all the people of the town are there. They're all crowded together. Even the town dog is there, right? Everyone's here. But if you think about the subject, it's called Burial or Known. And if you really try to look for the burial, you're kind of hard pressed to find it. Oh, there it is. Kind of at the bottom edge of the painting where you're almost overlooking it. And if you think about a romantic painting, they would have made the burial the actual focus. There probably would have been like angels flying around or something, right? So here, I love how the burial itself is completely downplayed in, contrast to playing up all the people, right, in their everydayness. Supposedly, one of the critics asked Courbet, well, who's being buried here? Because, to them, that should have been important. And he said, Delacroix and Romanticism. I'm like, oh, snap, Courbet, you go. So he kind of got a little art history clap back in, where he was like, it's Delacroix and Romanticism. Oh, yeah. So I always love when artists sort of fight each other or fight the movement before. And Courbet was very vocal about Romanticism. He thought Romanticism was ridiculous. It was overwrought. It was too emotional. And it just was lies. He was like, it's just lies. I paint the truth. I'm showing you the truth. Here's the truth. So he really endeavored to try to create these works. But again, critics were just like, what in the heck are we looking at, right? He also did it with sexuality. He did a lot of works where he looked at the brothels and the working women out on the streets of Paris. I had mentioned before, with the Industrial Revolution, a lot of women came to the city, but then they often couldn't find work, or they couldn't really do factory work. It was too hard on them. So what did they turn to? They turned to the world's oldest profession, prostitution. So the women on the left, they look like, oh, they're just down at the river and like, no. The flowers let you know that they're working girls, right? They're down there because they're sleeping. It's daytime. They're going to take a little nap before they have to work at night again. So it's not this bucolic scene that it seems to be. And then the women on the right, they're living in the brothel and, having a little fun off to the side. Now, why I say this, the sleep, that painting is really about reality. They've done numerous studies on prostitution where women who are prostitutes talk about how they sort of stop trusting men. They don't think of men as like, something sexually that appeals to them. They actually usually turn to lesbianism. So there's interesting studies that have been done on women trusting women when they work in the sex trade. And so I think Courbet is trying to get to the heart of this, right, in a very realistic way, saying, these women, when they're alone, they tend to gravitate to each other and hang out with each other in more ways than one. But again, these paintings would have been considered very shocking because normally when you think about, the idea of the nude, or you think about the gaze, you think about something like this, right? Or Titian's, Venus piece. You think about, the Venus of Urbino. You don't think about, the reality of these things. Usually it's a fantasy. It's a romantic idea. And Ingres' painting is a romantic painting. So again, it's a good indicator of what we normally consider, romantic. The most famous, of course, of Courbet's sexual pieces was Origin of the World. And I know some professors, they show this and they give like a warning before. They're like, warning, warning, vagina coming, right? I don't know why you would feel the need to do that, but, they can do that if they want. But it is a shocking painting, I think, because when we look at sexuality in a painting in art history, we're used to seeing it very romanticized, like the previous work I showed you, right? The Grand Odalisque. What Courbet does is he brings it to its essentials, as I like to say. He takes off all the romantic trappings. If you think about like lingerie and flowers and candy, Courbet would say, yeah, that's all window dressing. That's all romanticization. Victoria's Secret, all of that's just all nice little fluffy packaging until you get to the sex. The sex is at the heart of why you're becoming entangled with this. So he says, let me just dish up sex to you in the way that sex really is. And notice that he makes it about like a clinical reality. He does not give you a face to gaze at. Notice he crops out the woman's face and he just makes it about her vagina, and that's it. And it's not really posed or romanticized, right? The hair is still on it. Because if you look at a lot of romanticized paintings, the women are like almost like sculptures. They are very clean and white and pristine and hairless. And so this idea of showing her with her pubic hair very realistically, Courbet was making a statement about romanticism of women versus realism of sex, and kind of saying there's a difference between those two things, and maybe it's startling, it's not what you expect to see, but it's real.